Now yet another bind off that is available is something I call the Tunisian bind off. It's a form of a knit two together bind off, and there are two variations of it. Lucy Neatby just recently did a video on the second variation, and it's one I've used for years, and I've used it as many combo knitters have, because with combo knitting it makes a lot of sense to do a knit two together bind off. And sometimes we're so used to it that when we come to a row that, like a row of garter, doesn't have twisted stitches, we still want to do it. So let's do first the Tunisian bind off. And the Tunisian bind off is a knit two together bind off. And what we're going to do is knit two together, pull the stitch out, return the stitch to the needle, knit two together, pull a new stitch out, return the stitch to the needle, knit two together, pull the stitch out, return the stitch to the needle, knit two together, pull a stitch out, return the stitch to the needle, knit two together, pull the stitch out, knit two together. Now, always with a bind off that you do this, you want to make sure that as you pull the stitch out, you keep it loose, because it's going to have to do some double duty. So we're going to knit two together, pull the stitch out, return the stitch to the needle, knit two together, return to the needle, knit two together, return the stitch to the needle. And what we're going to get as a result is a row of bind offs that looks something like Tunisian crochet work, which is why I call it a Tunisian bind off. Okay, so let's do this, and we're going to put this needle here for the moment. It is a very different bind off. It doesn't look like a standard bind off, and it's less stretchy. It's inherently less stretchy. I've been working it very loosely, as you see, making the second stitch extended, and in spite of that, it's very much less stretchy. Now you think, well, that's no good, except you see it doesn't bind up. It's not barreling. It's not pulling tighter. It's just not stretching looser. This is a useful feature. This is a great bind off for shoulders. It's a great bind off for anything where you want to have some stability. The back of the neck of a sweater, before you add a collar. It is a bind off that's very easy to pick up stitches from. You can pick up your knit stitch because it's right there. You can see it, and you can then bind off a neckline, pick up stitches again very, very readily. See how easily it is to pick up stitches. I mean, I'm doing this through the viewfinder. I'm not even using my eyes, and it's really very easy. So that if you were doing a collar, you could then pick up the stitches, and from the front of the work it would look seamless, and from the back of the work you would clearly have a bind off, and the bind off would look not quite like a chain, but it would be a very stable back of neck. It's a way of adding stability to a back of neck and yet being able to pick up stitches. So that's version 1, the Tunisian bind off, or knit two together bind off. So now let me show you another way of doing a knit two together. Now, as I said, I tend to be a combination knitter, which is to say my stitches are mounted wrong, though occasionally I'll have a garter stitch edge or something and I'll want to bind off knitting two together. What I do then is put my needle into the first stitch as if to knit, and into the second stitch as if to purl, pull it through, put my stitch back on the needle, knit into the second stitch as if to purl, pull it through that cross, pull it through the cross. And as I say, Lucy Neatby just put up a video of this exact same bind off, And Lucy Neatby is also a combination knitter like me, and is used to doing a knit two together bind off that results in a standard bind off, and she has learned to do this bind off because it is a convenient bind off to do. I think it's easier, partly because you know, it's in two together, so it's less work, I think. And when you're done with this kind of bind off, it is just like a standard bind off. You have to just make sure to knit loosely to have it stretchy. It's a little tight, could have knit it looser. The looseness or the tightness really has nothing to do with how I'm working the bind, well, correction, not how the bind off is created, but how I'm working it. I'm not working it loosely enough. But it does look like a standard bind off. So there are two different variations of a knit two together bind off. A Tunisian bind off, which looks like a row of Tunisian crochet and is significantly less stretchy than the knitting, and a knit two together bind off where you knit into the first stitch and purl into the second, so as to actually be crossing the needles, crossing the stitches as you work, so that the stitch is mounted wrong. Let me mount it right, or correction, mount it as conventional. So you go in and out. Put it back on the needle, go in and come out. So there's another way of doing an edge that looks like a standard bind off, but isn't. Can you do this in the purl? Absolutely. In fact, it's slightly easier in the purl because you don't have to go, you just go into a standard purl and purl two together. And purling two together is an easier purl, an easier bind off than trying to lift the stitch over the needle, I think. I think it's easier. It's my opinion, but that is a way of doing the bind off. And again, any bind off is only going to be as loose as you work it. Any bind off is only going to be as stretchy as you work it. It is up to you, the knitter, to keep these stitches loose, not to pull the yarn tight, and not to have a tight bind off, because a tight bind off can ruin the look of your work, and certain things like socks or hats can actually ruin the actual finished project because it just doesn't work. So I'm going to come to the last stitch, and once again I'm not going to cut the yarn, but I'm going to just pull the stitch out so we can see what we have. So we have a Tunisian bind off, which is a standard knit two together. Put the stitch back on the needle and a standard knit two together, and the result is a bind off that is interesting looking and inherently less stretchy. Then we've done the same thing. We've knit two together and we've wanted to put the stitch back on the needle, and instead of doing a standard knit two together, we've gone into the second stitch as if to purl it, even though the yarn is in back, and then we've pulled it out and we have what looks like a standard bind off, and the final bind off is a purl two together, and that is, again, this one I was most conscientious about being loose, and it's the loosest, but the purl two together like a standard one. The purl rolls to the back of the work with the knitting, the knit rolls to the front of the work. So knitting two together is another way to bind off.